The Harmony Station was the kind of place that screamed, "We have more money than sense" in 17 different galactic languages. Picture the most expensive hotel you've ever seen. Then multiply it by 1,000 and stick it in orbit around a gas giant that looked like someone had tie-dyed it with nebula dust. Crystal spires jutted out at impossible angles, gravity fields hummed softly to accommodate dozens of different species, and the air recyclers worked overtime to maintain atmospheric conditions that wouldn't kill anyone important. This floating palace was hosting the first ever Galactic Peace Summit, which was basically a fancy way of saying let's all sit in a circle and pretend we don't want to shoot each other. Representatives from 47 different species had gathered to discuss forming some kind of unified galactic government. The kind of government that would definitely not collapse within 6 months due to bureaucratic incompetence and species-based prejudices. Definitely not. In the main conference hall, which was roughly the size of a football stadium and decorated with enough gold to buy a small moon, sat Riley Martinez. She was 22 years old, 5'4", and had the kind of face that made alien customs officials ask if she was old enough to be traveling without a guardian. Her black hair was pulled back in a professional bun, she wore a crisp navy blue suit that probably cost more than most people's cars, and she had the expression of someone who was trying very hard not to roll her eyes. Riley represented humanity, which was apparently hilarious to everyone else in the room. She'd been getting patronizing head pats and condescending smiles since the moment she'd stepped off the transport shuttle. The general consensus seemed to be that humans were adorable little creatures who had somehow managed to stumble into space travel without understanding what they were doing. Like toddlers who had figured out how to drive but still couldn't tie their own shoes. She sat in the corner of the vast amphitheater, taking notes on a tablet while the various alien delegates pontificated about the complexities of interstellar governance. Every few minutes one of them would glance over at her with the kind of amused tolerance you'd show a golden retriever that had wandered into a board meeting. Riley would smile politely and go back to her notes, which mostly consisted of detailed observations about which species had the most ridiculous hats and who was clearly compensating for something with their oversized ceremonial weapons. The seating arrangement alone was a masterclass in diplomatic condescension. The advanced species sat in the center ring, their chairs elevated on platforms that made them look down on everyone else. The moderately civilized species got the second tier, with slightly less impressive chairs and only minor platform elevation. And way in the back, almost hidden behind a decorative pillar, sat the human representative. Her chair was roughly the size of a kindergarten seat, and she was pretty sure someone had deliberately placed her next to the refreshment table so she could be easily ignored. The current speaker was droning on about trade regulations in the Outer Rim, gesturing with all 6 of his arms, while his translator collar struggled to keep up with his rapid-fire clicking and chittering. Riley made another note, this one about how the translator was apparently having a nervous breakdown trying to find polite equivalents for what sounded like a series of increasingly creative insults directed at the hegemony of Vortax. She'd been sitting there for 3 hours, listening to beings who looked like they'd been designed by committee discuss the future of galactic civilization. 3 hours of listening to species who could barely agree on what constituted breathable air debate the finer points of interstellar law. 3 hours of being treated like the class pet who was allowed to sit in on the grown-up meeting as long as she didn't make any noise. Riley took another sip of her coffee, which was the one thing about this whole summit that didn't disappoint. Apparently humans had managed to export their caffeine addiction to half the galaxy, and the space station's kitchen staff had clearly been briefed on the importance of keeping the human delegate properly caffeinated. She made a mental note to tip the staff well, assuming she survived the next 4 days of this diplomatic nightmare. The current speaker finally finished his presentation about tariff structures, and the room erupted in polite applause that sounded like rain on a tin roof, mixed with the mating calls of various endangered species. Riley clapped along, still taking notes, still being ignored, still wondering if anyone had bothered to actually read her file before deciding she was too young and cute to be taken seriously. She was about to find out just how wrong they were. The next speaker to take the podium was Commander Vexital. And if you've ever wondered what would happen if you crossed a lobster with a bodybuilder and gave it a superiority complex, well, wonder no more. He stood 8 feet tall on 6 muscular legs, his exoskeleton gleaming like polished armor, and his 6 arms moved in perfect coordination as he gestured to the holographic display behind him. His species, the Kethmori, had been the dominant military force in this sector for over 1,000 years, and he wasn't about to let anyone forget it. Esteemed colleagues, Vexital began, his voice carrying the kind of authority that suggested he'd never been told no in his entire life. The Kethmori Empire has maintained galactic stability through strength and discipline. Our military academies have produced the finest warriors in known space. Our fleets have never known defeat. He clicked through images of massive warships, orbital bombardments, and victory parades that looked like they'd been choreographed by someone with a fetish for synchronized marching. Riley made a note that roughly translated to compensating much, and tried not to snicker. We have conquered 14 star systems, pacified 37 rebellions, and maintained order through superior firepower and tactical brilliance, Vexitol continued, puffing out his chest plates like a peacock having an identity crisis. Perhaps the younger species could learn from our example. That last comment was delivered with a pointed look at Riley's corner, because subtlety was apparently not taught at those fancy military academies. A few of the other delegates chuckled appreciatively, the kind of polite laughter that said yes, we all agree the humans are adorable but useless. Next up was Ambassador Quilneth, who looked like someone had crossed a jellyfish with a philosophy professor and then given it delusions of grandeur. She floated 3 feet off the ground in a shimmer of bioluminescent tentacles, speaking in musical tones that her translator rendered as insufferably pretentious wisdom. Violence is the refuge of the unenlightened, Quilneth proclaimed, her tentacles swaying in what was probably meant to be a hypnotic pattern, but mostly just made Riley think of a car wash. My people, the ethereal collective, have transcended such primitive impulses. We resolve all conflicts through meditation, philosophical discourse, and the harmonious alignment of cosmic energies. Riley wrote down space hippies with superiority complex, and underlined it twice. We have achieved perfect peace within our borders for 3 centuries. Quilneth continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone explaining basic arithmetic to a particularly slow child. Perhaps if other species learned to embrace serenity over savagery, the galaxy would be a more enlightened place. Another pointed look at the human corner. Another round of polite chuckling. Riley was starting to see a pattern here. Dr. Morgrim took the stage next, and he was exactly what you'd get if you asked an artificial intelligence to design the most stereotypical mad scientist possible, then made him out of living crystal. He stood 12 feet tall, his body composed of interlocking geometric shapes that caught the light and threw it back in prismatic patterns. His voice sounded like wind chimes having an argument with a computer. The crystalline hegemony has achieved technological supremacy through pure intellectual pursuit, Morgrim announced, his crystal face somehow managing to look smug despite being completely expressionless. We have unlocked the secrets of quantum mechanics, mastered dimensional engineering, and achieved computational speeds that would fry the primitive neural networks of lesser species. He gestured to a holographic display showing incomprehensible equations, impossible architecture, and machines that looked like they'd been designed by someone who thought regular physics were just suggestions. Our cities exist in 17 dimensions simultaneously. Our computers can predict the future with 97% accuracy. Our children learn calculus before they learn to walk, Morgrim continued, his voice dripping with the kind of intellectual arrogance that made you want to explain basic human concepts like humility and getting punched in the face. Riley made a note that said probably fun at parties with enough sarcasm to power a small spacecraft. Perhaps, Morgrim concluded, other species should focus on education and intellectual development before attempting to participate in matters requiring actual intelligence. The third pointed look. The third round of condescending laughter. Riley was keeping score at this point. Throughout all of this, she continued taking her notes, occasionally raising her hand to ask innocent questions like, how do you define victory? Or what's your casualty to success ratio? Or have you tried turning your dimensional computers off and on again? The kind of questions that made the aliens exchange amused glances and explain things to her in the tone you'd use with a particularly curious house pet. Commander Vexitol actually patted her on the head at one point, which took considerable restraint on Riley's part not to demonstrate exactly why that was a bad idea. Ambassador Quilneth offered to teach her some basic meditation techniques for primitive minds. Dr. Morgrim suggested she might benefit from remedial mathematics education designed for pre-spaceflight civilizations. Riley smiled, and nodded and took more notes. She was particularly interested in their military capabilities, their technological limitations, and their complete inability to recognize a threat assessment when it was sitting right in front of them taking detailed notes on their weaknesses. The condescension was so thick, you could have cut it with a knife, assuming you could find a knife that wasn't too primitive for such an advanced gathering. Riley was starting to think these people had never encountered a species that didn't immediately prostrate themselves before superior alien wisdom. They seemed to genuinely believe that humans were harmless little creatures who had gotten lost on their way to a petting zoo, and accidentally stumbled into galactic politics. She was about to correct that misunderstanding in a very educational way. The morning session was winding down when Commander Vextol decided to have some fun. You know how some people can't resist poking a sleeping dog? Well, Vextol was that kind of person. Except the dog was a human diplomat, and he was about to learn why that's never a good idea. He'd been watching Riley all morning with the kind of amused interest you might show a circus act. Here was this tiny human female, barely out of adolescence by most species standards, sitting quietly in the corner and taking notes like she was auditing a college course instead of participating in the most important diplomatic gathering in galactic history. It was adorable, really, like watching a child play dress-up with grown-up clothes. Before we break for the midday meal, Vextall announced, his 6 arms spreading wide in a gesture that somehow managed to be both magnanimous and condescending. Perhaps our youngest delegate would like to contribute to the discussion. All eyes turned to Riley. 46 different species, each representing millions or billions of individuals, all focused on the small human woman in the corner. The attention should have been overwhelming. It should have made her nervous, or flustered, or at least caused her to drop her pen. Instead, Riley just looked up from her notes with the kind of polite attention you'd give a teacher who'd just called your name in class. We've heard much about military prowess and technological advancement. Vextall continued, his mandibles clicking in what passed for amusement among his people. But I'm curious about our human friend here. Tell me, little one, in your short time in space, have you ever actually killed anyone? The question hung in the air like a toxic gas leak. Several delegates shifted uncomfortably, because even in a galaxy full of species with wildly different social norms, asking someone about their kill count was generally considered either a military briefing or a very awkward first date question. Vextall was clearly expecting one of several responses. Maybe embarrassed stammering about how humans were peaceful explorers. Maybe some fumbling explanation about how her species had transcended violence. Maybe just nervous laughter and an admission that no, of course she hadn't, because humans were obviously too soft and civilized for actual warfare. What he got instead was Riley setting down her pen with the kind of deliberate care that made the room's temperature drop 10 degrees. She looked up at him with eyes that had suddenly gone very, very calm, and smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It wasn't even a particularly human smile. It was the kind of smile that suggested she'd just been asked her favorite question in the entire universe, and she was absolutely delighted to have the opportunity to answer it in detail. The room went quiet. Not the polite quiet of an audience waiting for a response, but the absolute suffocating quiet of a battlefield, where everyone suddenly realizes they've made a terrible tactical error. Riley's smile widened just a fraction, and somewhere in the back of the room, Ambassador Quillness' bioluminescent tentacles flickered nervously. Riley stood up slowly, smoothing down her skirt with the kind of casual precision that suggested she'd done this before. A lot. She clasped her hands behind her back, and began walking toward the center of the amphitheater, her heels clicking on the polished floor with the rhythm of a countdown timer. That's a fascinating question, Commander, she said, her voice carrying perfectly in the sudden silence. Have I ever killed anyone? Well, that depends on how you want to count it. She stopped directly in front of Vextall's platform, tilting her head up to look at him with that same pleasant smile. If you didn't know better, you'd think she was about to discuss the weather or maybe recommend a good restaurant. See, humans have this thing about killing each other. We're really, really good at it, like embarrassingly good. It's kind of our specialty. Riley began pacing slowly, her hands still clasped behind her back. We've been perfecting the art of murder for about 300,000 years, give or take a few millennia. Morgrim's crystalline form shifted slightly, light refracting through his geometric body in patterns that suggested sudden attention. Let's start with the classics, shall we? Early humans figured out that pointy sticks were more effective than harsh language. Then we discovered that rocks made excellent projectiles. But why stop there? We invented the sling, which could put a stone through someone's skull at 50 yards. David versus Goliath, you know. Little guy with a rock, big guy with armor and attitude. Guess who won? Riley's voice maintained that same cheerful conversational tone, like she was giving a presentation on her summer vacation. Then we got creative. The ancient Assyrians invented crucifixion, which was basically torture that took days to kill you. The Romans perfected it, and turned it into public entertainment. Nail someone to a cross, let them hang there until they suffocated from their own body weight. Very efficient, sent a clear message to the neighbors. Commander Vextall's 6 arms had gone very still. In the second tier, a delegate who looked like a bipedal mantis was making quiet chittering sounds of distress. But that was just individual killing. We really hit our stride with mass murder. The Mongols had this charming habit of completely depopulating cities that resisted them. 13 million people in 40 years, give or take. They'd build pyramids out of severed heads, just to make sure everyone got the point. Riley paused to gesture at the holographic displays that had been showing alien military achievements just minutes before. Medieval warfare was particularly artistic. We invented Greek fire, which was basically napalm 1,000 years before we invented napalm. Siege warfare where we'd catapult diseased corpses over city walls to spread plague. The Black Death killed a third of Europe, and we figured out how to weaponize it. Biological warfare before we even understood what biology was. Ambassador Quillneth's tentacles had stopped swaying entirely. Her bioluminescent patches were flickering in what any xenobiologist would recognize as extreme agitation. Then we discovered gunpowder, and oh boy did we run with that. Cannons that could punch through castle walls, muskets that could kill at a distance. We fought wars where tens of thousands died in single battles. The Battle of Gettysburg lasted 3 days, and left 50,000 casualties scattered across the Pennsylvania countryside. Riley's pacing had taken her in a slow circle around the amphitheater's center. Every delegate was tracking her movement like prey watching a predator. But the real masterpiece was the 20th century. That's when we figured out industrial-scale killing. World War I killed 17 million people in 4 years. We invented machine guns that could mow down hundreds in minutes. Poison gas that would melt your lungs. Artillery shells that could obliterate entire trenches full of soldiers. Dr. Morgram's voice cut through the silence, synthesized and shaking. Surely you're exaggerating the scale of 27 million dead in World War II. Riley continued without missing a beat. Just from my country alone, the Holocaust systematically murdered 6 million civilians using assembly line efficiency. We built factories specifically designed to kill people and dispose of the bodies. Gas chambers disguised as shower rooms. Crematoriums that ran 24 hours a day. The silence was now complete. Even the ambient hum of the station's life support systems seemed muted. And then we invented nuclear weapons. Riley's smile never wavered. We figured out how to split atoms and turn matter into energy. The bomb we dropped on Hiroshima killed 80,000 people instantly. Just vaporized them. Left shadows burned into concrete where they'd been standing. 3 days later, we did it again at Nagasaki, because apparently once wasn't enough to make our point. She stopped pacing and looked directly at Commander Vextal. We built bombs that could kill millions with a single detonation. Hydrogen bombs that made the Hiroshima weapon look like a firecracker. At the height of the Cold War, we had enough nuclear weapons to sterilize every planet in this sector. Mutually assured destruction, we called it. The promise that if anyone attacked us, we'd kill everyone on both sides and call it even. The commander's exoskeleton had gone completely rigid. His breathing apparatus was working overtime. Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. Riley continued, listing conflicts like she was reading a grocery list. Guerrilla warfare, improvised explosive devices, drone strikes, cyber warfare. We learned to kill people remotely, with robots, with computer viruses that could crash life support systems. She turned to address the wider assembly. We've perfected torture techniques that can keep someone alive and conscious for weeks while systematically destroying their sanity. We've developed biological weapons that target specific genetic markers. We've created artificial intelligence specifically designed to find more efficient ways to kill enemy combatants. Riley paused, looking around the room at 46 species who had all suddenly realized they might have made a terrible mistake in their assumptions about humanity. We fought wars in the vacuum of space before most of you had achieved powered flight. Ship-to-ship combat with nuclear torpedoes and particle beam weapons. Orbital bombardments that could crack continental shelves. We turned asteroid mining into weapons development, and figured out how to drop rocks on planets hard enough to cause extinction-level events. The silence stretched on. Somewhere in the back of the room, a delegate was making soft whimpering sounds. So to answer your original question, Commander, Riley said, her voice still pleasant and conversational, have I ever killed anyone? Well, that depends on whether you want the specific number, or if you'd prefer a general overview of my species' approach to conflict resolution. She clasped her hands in front of her, and waited for a response that wasn't coming. Riley let the silence stretch for exactly 15 seconds, counting in her head with the precision of someone who had learned to time explosives. Then she tilted her head slightly, as if she'd just remembered something delightful. Oh, but you probably want to know about me personally, don't you? She said, her voice brightening like she'd just been asked about her favorite hobby. I mean, all that history is fascinating, but it's not really answering your question about whether little old me has ever actually killed anyone. She began walking again, but this time her steps were different. Less casual stroll, more predatory prowl. The delegates tracked her movement with the kind of attention usually reserved for armed explosives. Well, I suppose I should mention that before I became a diplomat, I spent 8 years in the Human Colonial Defense Force. Lovely organization, really. They have this wonderful training program where they teach you 17 different ways to kill someone with your bare hands before breakfast, and then they give you increasingly sophisticated weapons to practice with after lunch. Riley paused in front of a delegate, who looked like a cross between a peacock and an octopus, all colorful feathers and nervous tentacles. The alien tried to shrink back in its chair. I started in basic infantry, which is where they teach you the fundamentals. How to field strip an assault rifle in 30 seconds. How to set up overlapping fields of fire. How to calculate trajectory compensation for different gravitational fields. Standard stuff, really. Every human child learns this sort of thing in school. That last part was a complete lie, but the aliens didn't know that. Several delegates exchanged horrified glances. My first deployment was to the Kepler 442 system, where we had a small piracy problem. Local crime syndicate thought they could shake down human shipping convoys. Adorable, really. They had these lovely little ships with plasma cannons and everything. Very shiny. Riley's smile took on a nostalgic quality, like she was remembering a particularly pleasant summer vacation. I was part of the boarding party for their flagship. 16 pirates, all armed with military-grade weapons, holed up in a ship designed for close-quarters combat. My squad leader gave me the choice of taking them alive or dead. I asked which would be more educational for the other pirate groups in the system. She stopped walking and looked directly at Commander Vextal, who was now making soft clicking sounds that his translator couldn't seem to process. Took me about 4 minutes to clear the ship. The pirates had this unfortunate habit of clustering together in defensive positions, which made them perfect targets for the fragmentation grenades I'd brought along. Very efficient. One pirate managed to get off a plasma burst that singed my hair, but that was more embarrassing than dangerous. Riley reached up and touched her hair, as if checking for damage that had healed years ago. The cleanup crew said it was some of the most thorough close-quarters elimination they'd ever documented. 16 confirmed kills, 0 friendly casualties, minimal structural damage to the ship. I got a commendation and a promotion. Also some very nice recommendations for advanced tactical training. Dr. Morgrim's crystalline form was refracting light in rapid nervous patterns. Advanced tactical training, he managed to synthesize. Oh yes, they sent me to the Naval War College on Luna. Fascinating place. They have this wonderful program where they teach you orbital mechanics, weapons systems integration, and strategic planning. I specialized in asymmetric warfare and counterinsurgency operations. Riley began listing her qualifications like she was updating her resume for a job interview. I'm certified in zero-gravity combat, planetary assault tactics, and what we call diplomatic intervention, which is a polite way of saying killing people who don't want to negotiate. I can pilot 17 different classes of military spacecraft, from single-seat fighters to dreadnought-class battleships. She paused to count on her fingers. I'm qualified on 43 different weapon systems, from sidearms to ship-mounted particle cannons. I can set up and operate field hospitals, coordinate orbital bombardments, and establish beachheads on hostile worlds. I speak 6 alien languages fluently, and can curse in 12 more. Ambassador Quilneth's tentacles had gone completely still, her bioluminescent patches flickering in what looked like a distress signal. My second deployment was to the Tau Ceti system, where we had reports of slave trading operations. Nasty business, that. 3 different alien species working together to kidnap human colonists and sell them to mining operations in the Outer Rim. Riley's voice took on a harder edge, though her smile never wavered. I led a strike team of 12 soldiers against a fortified compound on Tau Ceti Prime. The slavers had about 60 fighters, defensive positions, and some very impressive energy shields. They'd been operating for 3 years without interference from local authorities. She looked around the room, making eye contact with delegates who immediately tried to avoid her gaze. We hit them at dawn, local time. I coordinated the assault from orbit while simultaneously piloting a dropship and providing close air support. The whole operation took about 20 minutes from insertion to extraction. 63 confirmed kills, 0 human casualties, and we recovered 47 kidnapped colonists. Riley's tone became almost conversational again, as if she was discussing the weather. The local authorities were very grateful. They gave me a medal and asked if I'd consider staying on as a security consultant. I politely declined, because I'd already been accepted into the Diplomatic Corps training program. She turned back to Commander Vextal, who was now breathing heavily through his mandibles. My final deployment was to the Proxima Centauri system, where we had what the military calls a complex operational environment. 3 different alien factions fighting over territorial rights, with human colonies caught in the middle. Very messy situation. Riley began pacing again, her steps precise and measured. I was given operational command of a combined arms task force. 2 cruisers, 6 destroyers, and about 3,000 ground troops. The mission was to establish a stable ceasefire and protect human civilian populations. The aliens involved had been fighting for about 50 years, and weren't particularly interested in peace negotiations. She stopped and looked up at the ceiling, as if she was doing mental calculations. Took me about 6 weeks to resolve the situation. I used a combination of precision orbital strikes, psychological warfare, and what we call aggressive diplomacy. By the end of the operation, all three factions were very eager to sign a peace agreement. Riley looked back at the assembled delegates, all of whom were now sitting in complete silence. My final kill count for that operation was classified, but I can tell you that it was comprehensive. The after-action report used terms like decisive tactical superiority and exemplary leadership under fire. I was offered a promotion to admiral, but I decided that shooting problems was getting boring. She spread her hands in a gesture that might have been apologetic if not for the predatory gleam in her eyes. So I switched to diplomacy instead. Much more interesting, really. You get to meet new species, learn about different cultures, and occasionally explain to people why attacking humans is a really bad idea. Riley walked back to her chair and sat down, picking up her pen with the same casual precision she'd shown throughout her presentation. So to answer your original question, Commander Vextal, yes, I have killed people. Quite a few people, actually. But I prefer to think of it as aggressive conflict resolution with permanent results. She looked up at him with that same pleasant smile. Any other questions about human qualifications for this peace summit? The silence that followed Riley's question wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of absolute vacuum that occurs when an entire room full of supposedly intelligent beings simultaneously realizes they've made a catastrophic error in judgment. It was the silence of prey animals who had just discovered that the harmless little creature they'd been poking with sticks was actually an apex predator that had been playing with them. Commander Vextel, who had started this conversation with the confident swagger of someone who'd never met his match, was now making a sound that his translator couldn't process. It came out as a series of clicks and chittering that might have been his species' equivalent of nervous laughter, or possibly a prayer to whatever gods crustacean people worshipped when they realized they'd just insulted someone who collected kill counts like some people collected stamps. Riley sat back down in her kindergarten-sized chair with the kind of fluid grace that suddenly looked a lot less like youthful awkwardness, and a lot more like a coiled spring. She picked up her pen, clicked it once, and looked around the room with the patient expression of a teacher waiting for her students to finish processing a particularly difficult lesson. No questions. That's perfectly fine, she said, her voice returning to that same cheerful diplomatic tone she'd used when she first walked into the summit. I know that was a lot of information to process all at once. It's quite common for species to need time to adjust their assumptions about humanity. She made a note on her tablet, the stylus scratching across the surface with the only sound in the entire amphitheater. Somewhere in the back rows, a delegate who looked like a cross between a giraffe and a houseplant was hyperventilating through what appeared to be photosynthetic breathing organs. You know, Riley continued conversationally, this happens more often than you might think. Other species meet humans and assume we're some kind of peaceful, naive newcomers to the galactic community. It's a very natural mistake to make. She looked up from her notes with the kind of understanding smile you might give to a child who'd just learned that monsters were real. After all, we are relatively new to interstellar travel. We've only been in space for about 60 years, which is practically yesterday by galactic standards. And we do tend to send our friendliest, most diplomatic representatives to first contact situations. Riley gestured to herself with the kind of self-deprecating humor that now carried distinctly predatory undertones. I mean, look at me. 22 years old, barely 5 feet tall, degree in xenocultural studies with a minor in interspecies communication. I probably do look like someone who spends her time reading poetry and organizing charity fundraisers. Morgrim's crystalline form had been steadily shifting colors throughout Riley's presentation, and was now displaying what any xenobiologist would recognize as the crystal being equivalent of a panic attack. His voice synthesizer struggled to form words. But your species' psychological profiles indicated. Oh, those old things? Riley waved dismissively. Those were based on our civilian populations. Artists, scientists, teachers, engineers. Lovely people, very creative, generally opposed to violence as a solution to complex problems. She made another note, this one with a little smiley face, that somehow managed to look menacing. The thing is, we tend to keep our military personnel out of first contact situations. Bad for public relations, you understand. Most species prefer to meet the friendly face of humanity before they learn about the other side of human nature. Riley looked directly at Commander Vextel, who had gone so still that several delegates were beginning to wonder if he'd died of shock. Commander, I noticed earlier that you mentioned your species has maintained galactic stability for 1,000 years through superior military might. That's very impressive. How many species have you actually fought during that time? Vextel's mandibles moved soundlessly for several seconds before his translator managed to process a response. Our reputation precedes us. Most conflicts are resolved through the threat of force rather than, so you haven't actually had to fight anyone in quite some time. Riley nodded understandingly. That makes sense. Reputation is a very effective weapon, isn't it? Much more efficient than actual warfare. She made another note, this one longer and more detailed. The thing about humans is that we don't really have that luxury. We're new to the galactic community, so we haven't had time to build up the kind of reputation that makes people think twice about challenging us. We've had to earn our place through more direct methods. Ambassador Quilmeth's tentacles had begun moving again, but in tiny nervous twitches rather than the graceful swaying from before. Her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. How many conflicts has your species been involved in since achieving space travel? Riley tilted her head, considering the question with the kind of thoughtful expression that suggested she was doing complex mathematics in her head. Well, that depends on how you define conflict. Are we talking about full-scale wars, or are we including smaller operations like anti-piracy campaigns, territorial disputes, and humanitarian interventions? She began counting on her fingers. If we're just counting major military operations, I'd say we average about 6 per year. But if you include all the minor incidents, skirmishes, police actions, and what we diplomatically call kinetic negotiations, the number goes up considerably. The sound of furious note-taking suddenly filled the amphitheater as 46 different species began frantically recording every word Riley said. The human delegate, who had been dismissed as a harmless observer just an hour ago, was now being treated like a professor giving a lecture on applied nuclear physics. The interesting thing is, Riley continued, humans actually prefer diplomatic solutions to most problems. We really do. War is expensive, time-consuming, and tends to break things we might want to use later. But we've learned that other species take our diplomatic overtures more seriously when they're backed up by a demonstrated willingness to use force. She gestured around the room with her pen. Take this summit, for example. 3 months ago, when the invitations were first sent out, how many of you actually planned to take human proposals seriously? The silence was answer enough. That's what I thought. But now, after our little chat, I suspect that human perspectives on galactic security, trade agreements, and territorial boundaries might seem a bit more relevant to the discussion. Riley looked down at her notes, flipping through several pages of detailed observations. I've been taking notes on everyone's military capabilities, technological limitations, and strategic weaknesses throughout this morning's presentations. Not because I was planning anything, you understand, but because situational awareness is just good professional practice. She looked up with that same pleasant smile. For instance, Commander Vextel, your species' exoskeleton technology is very impressive, but your life support systems have a critical vulnerability to electromagnetic pulse weapons. Dr. Morgrim, your crystalline matrices are beautiful, but they're susceptible to specific sonic frequencies that would cause catastrophic resonance failure. Ambassador Quilmeth, your people's reliance on bioluminescent communication makes you extremely vulnerable to targeted photonic disruption. The note-taking had stopped. The aliens were now staring at Riley with the kind of horrified fascination usually reserved for natural disasters or particularly spectacular explosions. But that's just professional curiosity, Riley added quickly. I'm here as a diplomat, not a military analyst. My job is to help establish peaceful, mutually beneficial relationships between humanity and the galactic community. She closed her notebook and folded her hands on top of it. So, shall we move on to the next item on today's agenda? I believe we were discussing trade route security and anti-piracy cooperation. I have some very interesting ideas about coordinated enforcement strategies that I think you'll find educational. Riley looked around the room expectantly, pen poised over a fresh page in her notebook. Unless, of course, anyone else has questions about human qualifications for participating in galactic governance. The silence stretched on for exactly 30 seconds, before Dr. Morgrim's voice synthesizer managed to produce a sound that might have been no questions. Wonderful, Riley said brightly. Then let's talk about how to make space safer for everyone. I'm sure we can find some common ground. As she began outlining her proposals for coordinated anti-piracy operations, 46 different species took notes with the kind of desperate attention usually reserved for studying for final exams. The human delegate, who had been patronized and dismissed just an hour earlier, was now the most carefully listened to voice in the room. And somewhere in the back of her mind, Riley was already planning her next presentation on the importance of interspecies cooperation in maintaining galactic stability. After all, it was always better when everyone understood exactly where they stood. The summit continued, but the dynamic had changed completely. The cute little human in the kindergarten chair was now setting the agenda, and nobody was foolish enough to question her qualifications again. Riley made one final note in her notebook. Attitude adjustment successful. Proceed with diplomatic objectives. Then she smiled and began explaining why human participation in galactic security operations would be beneficial for everyone involved. It was going to be a very productive summit.